Picture this. It's 1977, and London's Wessex Studios is ground zero for a culture clash of epic proportions. In one room, you have Queen, crafting their album News of the World. In the studio next door, the Sex Pistols, hammering out their anti-everything anthem, Never Mind the Bollocks.
Is this the real life?
Well, we met the Sex Pistols in Wessex Studios, and I thought it was fascinating.
The two bands couldn't have been more different. Queen was all about polished perfection and, as Freddie famously said, bringing ballet to the masses. The Sex Pistols were about 3 chords and tearing it all down. A collision was pretty much inevitable. The first run-in was just plain weird. Johnny Rotten, the Pistols' singer, crawled on his hands and knees into Queen's studio, mumbled, "Hello, Freddie," and crawled right back out. Strange, but according to Brian May, Rotten was always respectful. Sid Vicious, the band's hot-headed and unpredictable bassist, was a completely different story. Fueled by Punk's nihilistic attitude and who knows what else, Vicious decided he was going to confront Mercury.
We aren't nice boys. We were fucking nasty little bastards.
He stumbled into Queen's control room, saw Freddie at the mixing desk and sneered, "Have you succeeded in bringing ballet to the masses yet?" The room went dead silent. Vicious was poking the bear, trying to get a rise out of Freddie, to mock his entire artistic mission.
Sid came in, and Sid was a moron, you know, he was an idiot.
Bad move. He had picked the wrong guy. Freddie Mercury, a man who had clawed his way from a boarding school in India to global rock stardom, wasn't about to be intimidated.
I called Sid Vicious, I called him Simon Ferocious or something, and he didn't like it at all. I said, "What are you going to do about it?"
Without missing a beat, Freddie stood up. What happened next is pure rock and roll folklore, getting Vicious's name wrong on purpose. "We're trying our best, dear." Then, according to those who were there, Freddie walked right up to Vicious, who was covered in safety pins, and flicked his jacket.
Fred went up and took him by the lapels and pushed him out the door.
The clash was more than a backstage tiff. It was symbolic. It was Freddie, the ultimate professional, effortlessly putting a so-called anarchist in his place. In the battle of wit and will, the Queen had easily checkmated the Pistol. If the run-in with Sid Vicious was a clash of bodies and beliefs, the bad blood with Paul Weller, the iconic leader of the Jam and the Style Council, was a war of words fought over musical purity.
I've got a good opportunity to actually express my feelings.
Weller, known as the Mod Father, was a giant in British music. But his idea of rock and roll was a million miles away from Queen's. Where Queen went for big, glamorous spectacle, Weller championed a rawer, more grounded, and aggressively British sound. That deep-seated difference in how they saw art bred a special kind of contempt from Weller, not just for Queen's music, but for Freddie Mercury himself. There wasn't one big blow-up like with Vicious. Instead, Weller just kept taking potshots in the press over the years. This anger was aimed squarely at Freddie's goal of mixing genres. In a now infamous interview with Uncut magazine, Weller blasted several music legends, but his comment about Freddie was particularly nasty. Mocking Mercury's ambition to bring ballet to the working classes, Weller used a crude and derogatory term to describe him. This wasn't just a critique. It was a flat-out rejection of what Freddie stood for as an artist. To a traditionalist like Weller, Freddie's grand mission wasn't innovation. It was a joke. The fact that Freddie refused to play by rock's unwritten rules seemed to really get under his skin.
Don't stop me now.
Queen absolutely conquered America, but not every American rocker was thrilled to see them. One of the most pointed and frankly weirdest feuds came from Steve Walsh, the lead singer of the arena rock band Kansas.
And that's what really makes me mad about bands, is because they look like they're just take the money and run bands. Because they really don't even perform to the people.
In the mid-70s, Kansas actually toured as an opening act for Queen, which gave Walsh a front-row seat to the whole Freddie Mercury phenomenon. and he was not a fan. In a 2003 interview, decades after that tour, Walsh's bitterness was still fresh. When asked about his time with Queen, he had great things to say about the other guys, calling them fantastic and real nice people. But his take on Freddie was brutal. He was an a-hole, Walsh said bluntly. When asked to explain, he didn't hold back. He was a primadonna, a diva, if you will. And for Walsh, that wasn't a compliment. He defined a diva as someone whose ego is way bigger than their talent, and in his view, that was Freddie to a T. This wasn't about the music. Walsh even noted that Queen was more of a flamboyant band, while his was more of a musical band. No, this was personal. Walsh just flat out didn't like Freddie as a person, finding his whole larger-than-life persona to be arrogant and difficult. The funny thing is, this beef seems to have been entirely a one-way street. There's no public record of Freddie Mercury ever saying a word about Steve Walsh or Kansas. Even Walsh's own bandmate, Rich Williams, said he had nothing but positive experiences with everyone in Queen, including Freddie. This suggests the problem was all on Walsh's side and never blew up into a public fight. It highlights a totally different kind of opposition Freddie faced. It wasn't about punk ideology or musical snobbery, but a simple clash of personalities backstage. Freddie's intense focus and powerful presence could clearly rub some people the wrong way. While Walsh admitted Mercury was a great showman, his personal dislike was so strong that he said, "I never liked the way he sang. I never liked the way he looked. I never liked anything about him." It's a pretty stark reminder that even if you're a globally beloved icon, you just can't please everyone. Freddie Mercury's entire life was a story of defiance. He defied genre, he defied convention, and he defied what it meant to be a frontman. That unapologetic spirit is exactly what made him a legend, but it's also what made him a target. The rivalries with people like Sid Vicious and the harsh words from musicians like Paul Weller and Steve Walsh were more than just backstage drama. They were miniature wars reflecting the bigger cultural battles happening in music.
We do what is best for the show. I don't really take myself that seriously. Not anymore. There was a time where in the early days where our music was very pompous and very serious, and people thought, oh God, what a load of bores, you know?
Punk versus prog. Raw energy versus high art theatricality. American grit versus British glam. It's also worth remembering that some of the most heated arguments Freddie ever had were with his own bandmates. Brian May once said the four of them were in a constant state of flux and had merciless fights over their music.
And to be honest, I'm sure Brian would say, in the end, we want to be respected as musicians.
But it was that very creative friction that forged some of the greatest rock anthems ever made.
I don't want to change people's lives by the music. I just want people, after I finish, to say that, okay, you know, Queen were a band that came out with good music.
So, in the end, do these feuds tarnish Freddie Mercury's legacy? Not a chance. If anything, they make it more real. They show us a man who wasn't some sanitized, one-dimensional icon, but a complex, passionate, and powerful human being who stood by his vision, no matter what. He could be witty, he could be a fighter, but he was always 100% himself. And that's why, all these years later, the world is still singing his songs.